Okay, in this video we're going to be looking at how the exchange rate and overseas growth rates can impact the level of economic growth. The exchange rate, as you can see, can impact multiple components within the aggregate demand equation, and it's important to make links to each of them when you're answering questions, because there often can be 3 or 4 mark questions. In terms of the exchange rate, it's the value of one currency in terms of another currency. So the Australian currency is expressed in terms of how much it can buy of foreign currencies. It can be measured against one particular currency, or there's a thing called the trade-weighted index, which is basically a measure of the value of the Australian dollar expressed in terms of its weighted against a weighted basket of foreign currencies. So what I mean by that is each country overseas gets a weight based on how much we trade with them. So countries with a high weighting are those countries we trade with a lot, like America and China. And basically what it does is it gives us an indication of what the Australian dollar is worth in comparison to a basket of foreign currencies. That are each weighted based on how much we trade with them. So the changes in the exchange rate have a big impact on the relative price of Australian goods and services compared to foreign goods and services for both Australians and foreigners, and that can have a big impact on the net exports component of aggregate demand. So firstly, what I'm going to take you through is examples when Australia is a price taker and a price maker. And these are really important terms because they really add to the quality of your responses when you're talking about the exchange rate. So many of the things that Australia sells, we don't actually choose the price. So for things like coal and iron ore and things like that, they have a price in American dollars, and we just accept that given price. So everyone, if you're buying coal or iron ore, that price of say it's $100 per ton, that price is the same for anyone that's selling it. So they might be selling coal from South Africa, from Indonesia, from China, from America. It doesn't matter. Basically, that's the price of coal at that point in time. So when Australians are price takers, it means that we don't set the price, and the price is determined by world markets, and we just accept the price that the world offers. So for example, if we're selling coal, the world market price for coal is based on the global demand and supply for coal, and we just accept whatever price that is. So this is why the exchange rate matters though. So let's say a miner is selling coal and it's getting $100 US per ton. If the Australian dollar is high, so the Australian dollar was to appreciate, when he converts that $100 back to Australian dollars, he's going to get a lot less money. So let's have a look at this example. Let's say 100 Australian dollars equals 100 US dollars. If he converts that 100 US dollars back into Australian, he receives 100 Australian dollars. Suddenly the Australian dollar depreciates. So now 100 Australian dollars is worth 50 US dollars. Or on the flip side, 1 Australian US dollar actually buys you 2 Australian dollars. So now when the miner receives his 100 US dollars, when he converts that back to Australian, he actually receives 200 Australian dollars because the American currency's got a lot more buying power in Australia. So for the Australian who's selling that money and receiving 100 US dollars, he's now getting 200 Australian dollars when the Australian dollar is low. So when Australia is a price taker and the dollar depreciates, when we convert that money back to Australian, we now receive more money, and that adds to the level of injections in the circular flow and boosts aggregate demand. If the Australian dollar was to appreciate, that 100 US dollars that the person's receiving, when he converts it back into Australian dollars, he's only getting 50 Australian dollars because the American dollar doesn't have as much purchasing power in Australia. So when we're selling stuff from overseas, when it costs them 100 Australian dollars, when we convert it back, we only get 50, and therefore the miner gets less money. So when the Australian dollar is high and we're a price taker, there's still the same demand for our products, but when we convert it back to Australian currency, we now get less money, and therefore there's less incomes for miners. That can lead to reduced consumption spending, can lead to reduced investment spending for firms because they're not making as much money, and so on and so forth. For other things, Australia is a price maker, which basically means that we set our prices. We determine what price we sell them for. So things like education and tourism, basically we set the price in Australian dollars, and then they have to pay that price. So if there's a depreciation of the Australian dollar, basically the Chinese tourist is looking to stay in Melbourne for $500 per night. When he converted his 5 yuan, he used to get 1 Australian dollar, and you have to pay 2,500 yuan to stay a night in Australia. If the Australian dollar was to depreciate, and now 1 Australian dollar buys 4 yuan, so the yuan's got slightly more purchasing power, it's now only costing him $2,000 to stay in Australia. So while the Australian's still receiving $500, doesn't really matter to us, there's going to be more demand for things like tourism because it's now cheaper for the overseas buyer to buy it. So according to the law of demand, there'll be more demand for things like tourism and education and things like that when the Australian dollar is low because it costs the relative price for them is now cheaper. And that's the important part there. Their purchasing power is increased, it's costing them less, and therefore they're more likely to come to Australia for their holidays. And when you're linking this, you can make links then to the increased consumption expenditure because the hotel owner is making more money, so he generates an income. It generates more employment because the person that's owning the hotel, more people are coming here, so there's more jobs for tour guides, for hotel managers, etc., etc. So when the Australian dollar is low, it's really good for aggregate demand for both price takers and price makers. Price takers receive more money for their exports. Price makers have more demand for their exports. It also impacts import and import competing firms, so that the price that Australian importers pay for their goods is usually determined by world markets, which basically means we just accept the price that they're selling it for. So when the value of the Australian dollar impacts the relative price of imports. So when there's a depreciation of the Australian dollar, it means that Australians are going to have to convert more of our currency to buy these imports, and therefore that basically means there's going to be more demand for Australian products because it's going to be too costly to buy imported products. So basically, when the Australian dollar is low, this is likely to result in a reduced demand for imports amongst Australians as our purchasing power falls, so there'll be less leakages for the economy. The higher relative price encourages consumers and the government to substitute into Australian goods and services. So import competing firms, which is firms that are selling goods to Australians but competing against foreign products, they're likely to experience a higher demand for their products as well. That will also boost aggregate demand because there's less leakages. So overall, an appreciation of the Australian dollar leads to more leakages, imports are cheaper. This leads to reduced demand for Australian import competing firms and leads to more unemployment. So when you're linking the exchange rate to aggregate demand, if you can make reference to price takers and price makers, you can make mention to the exporting, you can make mention to the demand it has for import competing products, you will have a really quality answer to that question. Last thing is the rate of economic growth overseas. An increase in economic growth is usually associated with increased disposable incomes overseas, and also a need for them to import more more inputs in production. So Australia, when you're making links to how overseas growth affects aggregate demand, it's really important that you refer to specific industries and then link that back to aggregate demand. So when overseas countries are growing faster, they generally require more of Australia's natural resources. So China's rapid growth has meant they've spent a lot more on infrastructure, therefore they've demanded a lot of Australia's coal and iron ore. So that's boosted aggregate demand because it's boosted the exports component through their infrastructure spending. So try and link strong overseas growth back to their infrastructure spending and therefore their demand for coal and iron ore. Also link it to the fact that strong growth overseas helps to boost their disposable incomes. So consumers with more income are more likely to purchase goods from other countries. So the key thing for Australia is China's got a growing middle class, and that has helped to boost demand for things like education and tourism in Australia, which has also boosted the export component of aggregate demand. This has boosted the level of injections into our economy, it's created jobs, which has created consumption spending, and therefore that's boosted the level of economic growth overall. So when you're referring to economic growth rates overseas, link it to their demand for our resources because they need it for infrastructure, for things like they buy coal and iron ore, and also link it to the fact that they have higher disposable incomes, and that boosts the demand for tourism and education. Thank you.